ASUS ROG Ally is basically a laptop. It has the same hardware, just in a weirdly shaped case. That means nothing prevents you from installing different operating systems onto your ROG Ally and dual booting them. There is a problem though. Normally you will use some kind of bootloader, for example Grub, to select the operating system you want to boot into. However, to actually select an operating system, you will need a USB keyboard attached to your ROG Ally. Bluetooth keyboards won't work until you boot into an operating system. That's why you will need an either wired keyboard or a wireless keyboard with a USB receiver, which you will plug into your ROG Ally. That's not a big issue at home, especially if you are using a dock for your ROG Ally with peripherals connected to it. However, selecting an operating system on the go or in the comfort of your couch may be a problem. And why would you want an external keyboard, given that the Ally has enough hardware buttons, but for some reason they don't work until you boot into operating system? On a Steam Deck, they do work. So on a Steam Deck, you can use, for example, the Dpad during the boot process to select an operating system in the boot manager. The reason for this is that Steam Deck's controller has its roots in discontinued Steam controller. That was a gamepad with the so-called lizard mode. That meant that if there is no driver loaded, the Steam gamepad and Steam Deck controls by extension act as a USB keyboard, and you can use the D-pad and the buttons in the same way you would use the arrow keys and, for example, enter keys on a normal keyboard. ROG Ally doesn't seem to have this feature. However, there is a way to select which operating system will boot on your ROG Ally without any external peripherals. To do that, you will first need to enter the BIOS. ROG Ally, being a normal PC, has a BIOS, and to enter it, you will need to hold volume down while the Ally boots. So just reboot the console, and as soon as the animation starts to appear, press and hold volume down. If the Ally is switched off, first turn it on, and then almost immediately hold down the volume decrease button. It may be a little bit tricky, sometimes it doesn't work, but if you try long enough, you will get the hang of it. In the BIOS, all the buttons and even the touchscreen work. Sometimes the buttons or the touchscreen or both don't work when you go into the BIOS, perhaps they are not initialized or whatever. In this case, you just need to press the power button to shut down the ROG Ally and then repeat the process. They will work eventually. Moreover, the legend on the keys in the BIOS has small symbols which correspond to the legend on the buttons of the ROG Ally. So you can use those buttons as hotkeys to access certain features in the BIOS. You can also use the D-pad and the buttons, or just touch the screen and access BIOS features as if you were using a mouse. Here in the BIOS, you need to open the boot menu. My particular unit displays 3 bootloaders that I have on the system. The first one is the standard Windows one, the second one is Grub from my Manjaro Linux installation, and I also installed a third one, which is called Refined, and that is a somewhat more user-friendly alternative to Grub. Basically, you can select the operating system here. Just use the D-pad and the buttons to boot the operating system you want. However, if you first enter the BIOS, then select some bootloader, for example Grub, from this boot menu, and load it, it turns out that the buttons and the touchscreen continue to work. So if I boot Grub from the boot selection menu in the BIOS, then I can use the D-pad and the buttons to control operating system selection in Grub. Moreover, if I boot, for example, Refined, which has mouse support, I can even use the touchscreen to select the operating system. This is how you can control which operating system to boot. So in a nutshell, you need to first go into BIOS and then select the needed bootloader from the boot menu, so it will load from there without rebooting the system. If you do it like so, the buttons will work. The only problem with this process is that it is a bit tedious. And maybe at some point in the future, ASUS will update the BIOS so the buttons will work in bootloaders without the need to go into the BIOS, or as it is correctly called in this case, UEFI first. And actually ASUS is pumping out BIOS updates for this system so often that they don't even bother to actually compile a what's new section. However, at this moment when I'm making this video, the only way to have the buttons work in bootloader is to go into BIOS first and then boot the needed bootloader from the boot menu.
I am the god of YouTube. Like, subscribe, thanks, jingle bells.